the messages that I want to get across in this presentation would be ones that you all well know and really don't need to hear. I want to address an issue which is often ignored, particularly in an audience here which is primarily from the discovery and development community, and that is the importance of the deployment, not forgetting the importance of how these drugs that you're or other interventions that you're ultimately developing are actually going to get deployed. And this is based upon the experience that I've had working in this field since the year 2000, initially with GSK, and for the last 7 or 8 years as a consultant. You'll also notice that my slides are fairly sparse. There's been a lot of fairly sort of interesting slides with graphs and charts and so on. I apologize, but the things I want to talk about are drawn from my experience as a consultant, but clearly I can't give you too much detail of individual examples for client confidentiality reasons. Now, one of the issues that came up during the discussion in the first session, and particularly around my friends from Liverpool around AWOL, was the fact that you've really got to understand that at the end of the day, who is the end user of the product. It's the metaphorical person living at the end of the rutted track in the village. Access is probably only on foot, roads are washed away. How you are actually going to deploy these drugs. And in NTD field, this is very much more talk about mass drug administration, so you're going to have quite large quantities of drug being distributed at regular intervals to a very large percentage of the population. You can't necessarily rely on patients coming to health centres. And so therefore, one of the things that I do emphasize to my clients, and I'm sure Mark and Steve won't mind me saying that was one of the things that we talked about a lot when we were working on the AWOL target product profile, is really getting to grips with this balance between what works from a clinical and safety perspective versus what is actually practical when you take a disease elimination program to scale. And by scale, we're talking about provinces and countries, not necessarily a few villages or a small regional area. So therefore, these are the sort of questions that I'm posing to my clients, and these are questions that need to be posed very early on in the process. And I'm gratified to see that in the presentation so far, these are being well thought through and well addressed. And I apologize to my industry colleagues who do this as second nature and don't need me to tell them about it. The second area that I just wanted to headline is the issue about being very, very well aware of regulatory requirements. Now, this is not just the sort of regulatory requirements that Brigitte and Andrew have been referring to, but it is also having a very fundamental thought about actually where are you going to be using the product. Now, I remember a discussion I had with an Indian company some time ago. The default position for where are you going to register your product is in a stringent regulatory authority, an Article 58 approval, equivalent FDA approval, and that is often driven by a perception that this is the only way you're going to get money out of the various funding agencies, which may or may not be true. But this particular organization said to me, we're only interested in supplying this particular product within the Indian environment. And therefore the question back to them was, well, in that case, do you need to worry about stringent regulatory authority approval? Is it acceptable to you and to the people who are going to use your product that you just go to an Indian approval, which may in fact be a much easier question. So this is an important balancing act again that has to be undertaken, is just default SRA, WHO pre-qualification, Article 58 approval. Is that the default position, or are there other ways which may actually mean that you can get your product to the market sooner without compromising the quality standards of efficacy and safety and manufacturing quality that you want to? It is important, as Andrew said, that you understand what are the clinical requirements, the regulatory requirements of where you're going to do it. I'd also highlight the issue of international guidelines. Now, this, as many of you will know, is a moving feast. Guidelines change. I can remember in malaria, guidelines change often with very little consideration of the impact that has on the entire supply chain process. So you need to be looking at those guidelines on an ongoing basis. And also when you're working and introducing new products and new concepts to the market, then you need to be out there influencing the people who are writing the guidelines sooner rather than later. And again, I can think of an example of a colleague of mine working in the area of HIV who has struggled because the guideline, their product has got ahead of the guidelines. They have a product now that they can market, but nobody can buy it because it isn't in a WHO-approved treatment protocol. Also, I think you need to be aware of procurement agency requirements. Now, this may, as I'll come on to in a minute, be later on in the development process, but again, thinking about this sooner rather than later in the development process means that what doesn't happen is you get to a product, you actually get a registration, and everything comes to a grinding halt because you've forgotten to think about who is going to be buying your product. In the case of malaria and TB and HIV, the Global Fund, but it may be for the diseases that most of us are talking about here, other agencies. But what are the guidelines? What are their requirements? How are they going to purchase these products? What are they going to expect the people manufacturing the product to be doing, and what will they themselves be doing? And this brings me on to the other point that I want to raise, and that is the question around thinking about how the product is going to be manufactured early, particularly the API. Because what you have is often forgotten is that because we're operating in the NTD space, in an area where you're either expected at the moment to be donating your drugs free of charge, or that you are being expected to sell them at little or no profit, then, and often, certainly for many of the companies that I've dealt with, the R&D costs are being risk shared, and a lot of the costs are being paid for by various organisations, be it DINDI, be it the Wellcome Trust, be it some of the other PDPs. But once the product actually hits the market, there is very little incentive for the manufacturers to do post-registration process improvement. You are going to be stuck with a manufacturing process in many cases that was what went through the regulatory process. Now, that is not true for a quote-unquote normal pharmaceutical product, where there is room through the life cycle management phase for the product, for the manufacturers to undergo process improvement, and you see this with any generic company. And the other thing, of course, also then leading up to that is the question of where do you locate the manufacturer? And there is this big move to put manufacturing of many of the products that you will be developing for NTDs into endemic countries. But then again, that also comes with a cost in terms of the regulatory implications, the cost of actually manufacturing and delivering the product, the transportation costs and so on. And this has got to be thought about. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong where you do the manufacture, but these are thoughts that need to be into the planning process, and the sooner one does it, the better. Because if one takes this highly simplified cartoon of the development process, which I'm sure you've all seen, but everybody focuses on the bits in blue, which is essentially around the drug actually being put into living animals or human beings. But underneath that, there is a whole series of processes which are around the actual mechanics if one can put it that way, of getting the drug to the market. And I just highlighted here the fact that normally one is developing the manufacturing process through to here, and that needs to be really locked down before you start your major phase 3 studies. So you're doing your phase 3 studies with this final formulation, your process, your API manufacture, so that you've got all your regulatory requirements in line. And I've seen examples of people who are in this phase thinking that they're going to go into this phase here without this worked out. And clearly, you're going to end up in a situation where you're going to have to go back and redo things. And this is quite commonly an issue with organizations that are quite small and don't think that, and clearly do not understand the actual process. And I'm glad to say I don't think I see anybody in the audience here today who would fall into that category. But it is something that needs to be not to be forgotten about. So, in conclusion, the point I'm making here is that these issues around when and how and the products that you are in the process of discovering and developing are going to get properly deployed. So there will be a seamless transition from discovery through development and then to deployment, and not have any unnecessary breaks at that development to deployment point, is around not focusing only on clinical safety and efficacy, but not forgetting that all of those underlying processes that need to be done. So that means thinking ahead, planning ahead, and getting advice and assistance early. If you're in collaboration, as several of the speakers earlier said, they're already working with industry organizations, this comes as part of the package. But other groups that I know don't get that, and they need to find ways of getting this advice and assistance early enough so that the planning doesn't result, as I said before, in a juddering halt at the point that you actually want to deploy the product. Thank you.